Hi everyone, welcome to the Moreland Library's webinar of Off-Grid Living in the Suburbs. My name is Donna Luckman and I'm the Zero Carbon Campaigns Lead at Moreland City Council. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I and many of our panel tonight are presenting on the land of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. As the traditional custodians of the surrounding lands and waterways, I pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, as well to all the First Nations communities who significantly contribute to the life of the area around Melbourne and across the nation. Today, we have three excellent panellists who'll be looking at the question of living off-grid in the suburbs. We have Dr. Rachel Goldlust, Secretary of Earthship Australia, Stuart and Macquarie, a Moreland resident and author of Not Down the Drain, and Glen Morris from Solarquip. So each of these presenters will give a short 5-minute presentation looking at different aspects of energy and water independence and how you can live more sustainably. At the end of the presentations, we're handing it over to you. We want to hear your questions. We want to hear what you want us to actually discuss. So while you're listening to the presentations, please put your questions and the comments in the comment sections below the video, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. If you can write succinct questions, it would be great. And if you'd like a certain presenter to answer one of your questions, just pop their name at the start of the question. As always, please be polite and all comments must comply with the community guidelines found beneath the About section on the library Facebook page. And just letting you all know that we are recording this webinar and it will be available later on for other people to watch too. So let's just get straight into it, shall we? So I'm going to introduce our first speaker, which is Dr. Rachel Goldlust. Rachel is a town planner, an environmental educator, and natural building designer as part of work over 10 years for Earthship Australia. She's just completed, well actually a while ago, her PhD in environmental history on going off-grid in Australia. And she currently works with me in the team as Sustainable Communities Unit team at Moreland City Council. So it's actually nice seeing her getting to present tonight. So I hand it over to you, Rachel.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you everyone for tuning in tonight. We've got a lot to get through, so I'm just going to get started. I've been given the first position because I thought it would be valuable to give a bit of an overview about the sort of how and why, or maybe the whys and why for about going off-grid in the suburbs. And I'm going to give some things to think about, some sort of general guidelines, and some of the more technical things will come a bit later with Glen, and Stuart will be telling his story about going off-grid or semi-off-grid in the suburbs of Moreland. So sort of building on the work that I've done for Earthship Australia and the many presentations that I've given on people looking to live a bit more self-sufficiently, I'm just going to talk very quickly to a few slides which might give people some ideas for questions or things they want to think about. First up here, I've just put up Michael Mobbs' Sustainable House. If you haven't found or come across Michael Mobbs in your off-grid journey yet, I would highly recommend his book or his website. He very famously took his inner city Sydney terrace off-grid in 1996, well before any of us was even thinking about it or talking about it, and has since become quite celebrated in sort of advocating for people who would like to detach various services or systems from the grid. And he gives tours and he does talks and he does lectures. I just thought I would give him a bit of a plug. So I'd start tonight by asking why, and why are we thinking about going off-grid, and why we're thinking about living more sustainably in this way. And one of my answers is about sort of the belief in having a smaller carbon footprint, and it means living with using fewer materials and also using what we have at hand or what we have locally to minimise the footprint that we have with our lifestyle in our home. So I come from the sort of building and design background, and building or green building and being more self-sufficient is about being smart about how we use resources to minimise our impact on the environment and to create a home that ultimately looks after us and the planet. I also believe that it means empowering ourselves to create the kind of spaces that we want to live in and the kind of homes that really reflect our values and that suit our needs and that can be shaped around the changing aspects of our lives. So beyond cost and cost benefits, which I'm sure we'll get to talk about tonight, it's also, for me and my experience, about believing that our domestic decisions have repercussions on the wider world and also on our health and well-being. So it's about creating vital communities and it's about sharing information, which is what we're doing tonight. So when you're thinking about going off grid, particularly in the suburbs, there's a number of reasons. In my research, I found dozens and dozens of reasons why people choose to go off grid. I've put a few in here, and there's a very strong idea about being less dependent. And I feel like in our recent lockdown experience here in Melbourne, a lot of people started to have these sort of questions about what happens when the system becomes less dependable and what can we do to make sure that we can look after ourselves and our communities when outside resources are unreliable or getting more scarce. And a lot of people seem to feel that going off grid will give them some of that security so that they can look after themselves and their family. The issue of solar power is an affordability and definitely when it comes to batteries and the like, is making that decision more clear for people as more people are putting on domestic solar. It's about avoiding consumerism and sort of living a bit more simply and also living with a sort of basic technological baseline of things that you need as opposed to what you want. And I also found there was a strong tendency of people to feel that it was important to take back some of the control over what they could make and do. So it was re-engaging with the idea of providing the basics for ourselves and our families. So about growing food, about collecting water, and about creating or adapting the shelter that we live in. So from experience and talking to many people, these are some of the things that I suggest people really sort of take on board if they're thinking about going down this pathway. One of the first rules of permaculture is to look and observe. And so to look and observe on your site or your home or your block or whatever it is you've got to work with and look at the natural features and to look at also what's happening around you. So I always say to people who are thinking of moving to an area to sort of look around that area and see what's happening there. So see if people have already started to put up solar panels or started to engage with other aspects of energy efficiency. And it's a good place to start because you know that there's already going to be a conversation happening, particularly when it comes to having that conversation with your local council. So asking questions of your neighbours is also important to see what happened, what sort of experiences they had, what they went through, and how they went about getting to the destination that they wanted to get to. Through that, you can make connections with your community that affords you the ability to do kind of bulk buys or, learn from other people's mistakes or to, consume less by doing it collectively. I always say to plan early. It inevitably leads to a lower cost project if you give yourself a good amount of time, and to be flexible with what is possible wherever you are. There's always going to be hurdles, and also to think a little bit smaller, and whatever you're trying to achieve can always be more achievable if you start small and build upon it later. There's often issues about needs and rights, and this is just, I'll quickly go through about, people's situations can be varied from buying to renting, building or retrofitting. So if people are taking existing houses and looking to move them or start from scratch. So there's always issues around the legalities, and that will come down to also the permits and the things that you're allowed to do in your area. It's important to think about what's happening in the future. So what's happening in the future in the area, and that comes down to shading, particularly as there's often can be high-rise construction happening in your area that might block your solar gain and really affect your ability to supply your own power. Industrial activity, whether that be, same thing, fog or noise or pollution, that will affect your water source and your ability to catch water. And then there's also winds that might affect the way you choose to build. There's always going to be an issue of price and economics and what you can afford to do, and whether or not you have the ability to start from scratch or to slowly do little bits here and there. And then there's also the issue of neighbours and your community, and whether you will find down the line there might be problems with what you're trying to do if you don't have good communication with the people around you. Many a project comes unstuck by their neighbours. Quickly, I'll go through some of the considerations. There might be restrictions as well, so that will come down to having conversations with council or with a building planner or with an architect to find out whether or not there's restrictions on your site or your proposed site. That includes sort of zoning and covenants and water and access. Orientation and gradients like slopes can often be really important when it comes to maximising solar gain and maximising your ability to passively heat and cool your home. Flooding can be an issue depending on where you are. What you're building on can often be an issue that needs to be thought about if you're building from scratch. And then what is nearby is also worth thinking about in terms of how far are you going to be going to get the things that you're needing. Do you have tradesmen or community resources that you can share or borrow in your area? Quickly put a plug in for passive solar design, because we're talking about energy efficiency ultimately, and we're talking about maximising, and a lot of it comes down to good design. So before thinking about how many panels you can put up on your roof, it's worth thinking about other ways that you can maximise your efficiency of your home. And there's a lot of information that Moreland has put up with the Australian Energy Foundation that really gives you some good insights onto things that you can do that make your home more energy efficient, and that includes the way you heat and cool, and that includes lighting, hot water, showers, all of those things. There's so many more tricks that we know now that we didn't know when most of these houses were built that can really give you an indication. So I'll leave that there, and then I'll hand it over to Stuart.
I'll do a little intro for Stuart before we do that. But thanks very much, Rachel. And once again, if you've got some comments or questions for Rachel, please pop them in the comment section underneath the video. So our next speaker is Stuart and McQuire, and he, with his partner Wendy, have transformed their family home to be one of Australia's leading homes for environmental sustainability. And as a person who's been fortunate to go to Stuart's home a few times, I must say it's such a beautiful part of our Moreland community to go and visit. In 1996, their home became the first, actually, I think the second in Australia to actually put solar panels and connect to the grid. I think it's still a bit of a controversy, actually, if you're the first in Victoria or not, Stuart. I think there's actually someone else who's trying to claim that as well. But he is also the author of Water Not Down the Drain, which showcases how you can reduce your water use and also look at reusing water on your property as well. So I'll hand it over to Stuart.
Thanks, Donna, and thanks, Rachel, for that informative presentation too. We've got some slides to go through, which Glen is going to put up kindly. Go to the first one. Yeah, that's it. It's a typical like suburban home, 1929, makes it 92 years old this year. And for Moreland, it's sort of in the suburban part of West Brunswick. And the block is like a bigger block than a lot of Brunswick, but typical of a lot of suburban Melbourne. Next slide, please. So with going off grid, like there's different ideas of what it can mean, whether it be standalone, self-sufficient, independent, sustainable. And it can include like generating your own electricity or going off gas completely, going for zero carbon or eliminating greenhouse emissions, reducing or disconnecting from mains, and also maybe disconnecting from sewer or putting less into it, going for zero waste or not putting waste to landfill, and some people, quitting single-use plastics. You might want to stop using petrol or diesel by going to an electric car, or you might want to stop using the car altogether. And when we were discussing this the other day, the other panellists suggested telecommunications, but I suspect if you're watching this, you haven't disconnected from those. Go to the next slide, please, Glenn. So for the West Brunswick Sustainable House, I've lived in it for over 30 years now with my partner, Wendy. Initially, we bought it with a couple of other people who moved on after a bit, and we've raised 2 children here who no longer live with us. But we did things with an approach of do what you can when you can. So some of the low cost, no cost things were right up front, like 1991. But then other things like solar hot water was, I think, 1994. Solar electricity, Donna mentioned, was 1996. Rainwater tanks, I think they were the early 90s. And water recycling, the low cost was straight away, and then higher cost as opportunities arose. We're very much influenced by permaculture and have a permaculture style garden and shooks. Where we can, we source sustainable materials, as opposed to, like we try to put that into purchasing decisions and also reduce waste. And I've worked from a home office until COVID started, which ironically stopped my work completely. But for about 20 years, I worked from a home office. So next slide, please, Glenn. So part of it is not just going for no impact, but having a positive relationship with the environment so that you end up with a comfortable home, a place you enjoy living in, and it has a beneficial relationship, rain or shine. And we're catching rainwater, obviously, and harvesting the solar electricity. Next slide, please. Early on, like I think 1994, we did an assessment of energy, greenhouse emissions, water consumption from mains, an estimate of waste disposed, and also estimate of transport through the various means, and then made plans to change what we could based on that assessment. So that's one thing I'd recommend. Go to the next slide, please, Glenn. This is a graph early on showing the solar electricity production and our electricity consumption, like its first 10 or 11 years or something. But ever since 1996, we've generated more electricity than we used. We're not off grid in that the surplus goes back into the grid, but we have pretty much not paid for electricity for 24 or so years, and the original system lasted 23 years, the same inverter, same solar panels. The inverter stopped working and we ended up with a new system to replace it. If we go to the next slide, please, Glenn. So we've done a lot with water, rainwater and recycled water and diversion of greywater and reducing mains water consumption, but we monitored it really closely for a while. We tend not to these days, but in the driest year on record for Melbourne, like when that was sort of at the end of that 10-year-long drought, we got down as low as 4 litres per person per day of mains water, and we didn't actually run out of rainwater during that dry year. So it's sort of showing that you can go a long way, even if you still, like we have mains as the backup. So again, we're not off grid quite, but we'll go to the next slide. Thanks, Glenn. But part of what we've, like for quite a long while we weren't using mains water on the garden, but we've changed our mind on that. Like when you look at the water footprint of food, it's massive, particularly for meat and dairy, but also for other things. And it's sort of an artificial thing to not use any water on your site, but then buy food from elsewhere that has a huge water debt. So we now do use mains water on the garden when we need to. Like over this summer, we haven't really needed to because of the rain we've had, which has been great. But last summer, when it was a lot hotter and drier, if you remember back to all those bushfires and hot weather, we did use a fair bit of mains water on the garden. If we go to the next slide. So part of it for us has been the recycling and not throwing particularly organic waste into the general waste or the landfill bin. And so a lot of that gets processed on site for compost or worms. And we go to the next slide. And also for chooks, and they're part of the recycling, but also food production and to some extent pets. They all have their own personalities. So that's it for me, but hopefully we'll have a bit more discussion as this session goes on. Thanks.
Thanks, Stuart. And introduce our final speaker, who actually is our AVI guy at the same time as well. So Glen's doing a lot of multitasking tonight. So it's Glen Morris, and through his business, Solarquip has been installing renewable energy systems both on and off grid for over 25 years. Glen consults for the Smart Energy Council, has taught renewable energy courses at various technical institutes throughout Australia, and runs the Smart Energy Lab in the Yarra Valley. Glen has lived off-grid for much of the past 30 years. So over to you, Glen.
Thanks very much, Donna. Yeah, it's great to be here, and it's kind of funny talking about going off-grid in the suburbs. From my experience, I've always kind of lived off-grid, but it's very different in the suburbs because of land use and some of the things covered already by our previous speakers. So awareness of noise and neighbours and overshadowing. So a lot of those problems go away when you're in a rural situation, but some of the same principles apply. So I'm kind of the tech guy here tonight, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the tech stuff associated with that. So let me just bring that up for you. Where's my little keynote? Here we go. Yeah, so that's where I live, on top of Mount Tillibawong in the Yarra Valley on an off-grid community. So why do people want to use renewable energy? And mostly that's solar power. Now, there are many forms of renewable energy. Of course, there's wind and there's hydro and there's biomass if it's renewably generated. But solar has become so affordable, and certainly in the suburbs is probably a more practical choice. No one wants to have a neighbour with a noisy wind turbine or a rather smelly biodigester. Maybe Stuart's got one, but anyway, sorry, Stuart. But it has become incredibly affordable. So that's, Australia is the world leader per capita for solar. Like, we have more homes with solar than any other country per capita. And it's because of the low cost. And I suppose we're affluent, we can afford it, and we're in a sunny country. In fact, if you were to talk about sunny countries, there's only a couple of places sunnier than Australia. That's Saudi Arabia and the Gobi Desert. So we really have it made for solar energy. Even in Melbourne. Don't diss Melbourne, by the way. I'm going to give you some stats on that in a minute. But I'd like to pick up on something that Rachel said, energy efficiency. And I think Stuart touched on this as well. People often go for the tech solution when the easy and cheap and better solutions are right in front of you. And that's stuff like energy efficiency, choosing appliances with high star ratings, using your finger to turn stuff off. Your finger can be a very powerful tool in energy efficiency. So those are some of the lowest cost options for reducing electrical energy consumption. So think of those first before you start reaching out to more techie solutions. Some of the other ones which you probably already have, for instance, hot water. People often think they hear about batteries and it's all very exciting. Batteries are the new solar for some people. But actually, the economics, I don't think, are still there yet. But you've actually probably got already a battery sitting on the side of your house if you're not gas hot water. It's called an electric hot water service. And it's a place that you can divert a lot of renewable energy to and heat it with renewable sources as opposed to non-renewable. So you may discover that your hot water service actually is the battery you already have. The benefit of solar is that most homes, freestanding homes anyway, have ample space to produce as much energy as the average home uses. So the average inefficient home in Australia uses about 20 kilowatt hours per day. I'd suggest you could halve that just through smart selection of appliances and general efficiency gains, and so even on a small house, such as in Moreland area, the houses may not be quite on such large blocks. There's certainly ample room if you have unshaded locations. So you can do assessments. I've actually shown here an assessment of a roof for Melbourne, and you'll note that even the south side of the roof actually still produces a sizable amount of energy. So don't rule out the south side of your house. I call it the new north because it's often got nothing on it. Hot water service is already on the north side. we are lucky in Victoria to be able to access a lot of rebates for renewable energy sources such as solar panels, hot water. There are battery rebates. There's even Solar for Renters program. I think that's still running. I'm not quite across all the government rebates, but they keep coming and going. But Solar Victoria is the place to go, and it's made it extremely affordable because you can double dip. You can get the Victorian rebates for renewables, and you can also get the federal solar rebates. Now, the federal solar rebate actually is part of our contribution to producing clean energy, and there's a small-scale renewable scheme that will phase out in 2030. So we've got 10 years left on it, and as you can see from the numbers I've just put here on the screen, actually it's a really big discount. So if you get the full value of your STCs, I just made a misprint there, it's $40 each, not $49, but the correct number is $3,120 on a 6.6 kilowatt system. That's a really big discount. So you can see why solar is so affordable. Now, many people live in homes that have some shading issues. It could be self-inflicted, such as a chimney. It could be your neighbour's tree, whatever, antennas and satellite dishes. But there are some devices that help solar panels work better when there is localized shading. Now, if the whole roof is shaded, there's not much you can do about that. But if you've just got shading on some parts of your roof, it actually can be detrimental to the unshaded parts of a solar array. And that's where what they call module level power electronics come along. Now, there's two basic types. There's the DC ones, such as these. They call them optimizers. And what they do for you is make every panel independent of every other panel. They all work as best they can. So here's a picture of my neighbour's house, and she's got a bit of shade on the western side, certainly in the morning on some of her panels. And that one panel, the fourth one from the left, is a bit underperforming, but it doesn't really matter because the rest of them are doing really well. So it's not compromising the system by having one shaded panel. There's also microinverters. Now, they're different because they are AC devices, and they also go on each panel, and they give you that same level of module level independence, and it allows for shade tolerance. Now, I'm coming to batteries last because I did say the economics, I think, are not there yet, but unless you need them for other reasons. So if you're thinking about going off-grid in the suburbs and you want to be able to use energy independently of the grid, you probably will need a battery unless you're prepared for the lights to go out every night. In fact, solar inverters only work when there's a grid connected to them. So without a battery, you'd have no power day and night. Batteries have got more affordable. They're trending down at about 15% per annum. So really, it's just a matter of time before they are the right choice, probably a year or two or more, but it depends on the technology. Can batteries be added to an existing system? So Stuart might be thinking, he's probably already looked into this. Stuart, how old is your system? About 20 years plus? Can I add batteries to it? Well, certainly if it's what they call AC coupled. So it just connects to the existing switchboard and can add the storage to your existing system. So it can be added, but there are sometimes utility limits, and the supply authority may give you limits on how much inverter power you can connect. So you will need to discuss that. Just to finish up with a bit on economics, look, here's a house that a friend of mine in suburbia has got, and we put some solar on it, and we considered whether to put solar and batteries versus just solar. So putting on just solar, and this is based on data actually from the ATA, or now called Renew, showing that the payback is very quick. And so for this system, the payback was 5 years. Now, this slide's actually about 3 years old. I'd say it's about 4 years now, or even less. It's amazing how quick that payback's occurring. But if we paid for a battery, it blows it out. It blows it out to 9 to 10 years, which is about the warranty on the battery. So you'd have to ask yourself, is it really worth it to add a battery? If the only reason is saving money, it would have to be about independence. And that is what a battery can give you in terms of energy. So here's my house, actually. I've got a whole range of ways of using the sun's energy. I've got directly heated hot water from photovoltaic panels. I've got solar thermal systems, which use evacuated tubes to heat water. I've got solar PV to generate electricity. And some of that is also diverted into a resistive element. So there's lots of ways of capturing it. So just on a relatively small house, it's about 160 square meters total. I've got like 10 kilowatts of solar squeezed onto my house. The other big benefit too, by the way, is shading. Those panels shade my house. There's actually not much roof that's exposed to the sun. So it really helps with the cooling load. So finishing up, that's where I live at Murramurra Co-op. We've been off-grid for 47 years here at the Co-op, and it's fun. We love it, and it's become so much more achievable. So thanks very much, and back to you, Donna.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Then I might get you to do your magic and bring all the panellists back up on the screen as we start going through some of the questions. And we've got a few coming through. Just a reminder, just put them on the bottom underneath the video, and I'm just start scrolling through some of them. And maybe we'll just address the one a little bit, that the first question, which is for you, Stuart. It's about what's the hardest part of going off grid with solar and water? And probably maybe you might want to talk about how you are on the grid and why you do stay on the grid.
Yeah, look, like with solar, like as far as I know, Donna, I didn't know someone was disputing this, but we were the first in Victoria. It was actually initiated by the council-owned electricity supplier, like it was Brunswick Council at the time. But there was no Australian standard, so the panels actually went up in 1995 and went through the first summer not connected, so it was a bit frustrating. And they weren't connected until April 1996. But I guess the hard bit was the Brunswick Electricity took the initiative and they did the hard work. Like we just put our hand up to say our house would do it, and we parted with $5,000. Like at the time, that was about 20% of our annual income, and we didn't own a car. When we did buy a car, it cost $4,000. So compared to today's prices, $5,000, you can buy solar panels for $5,000 now, but you'll get a lot more. Like people wouldn't have thought about 5 or 6 or 10 kilowatts of panels. We had 2 kilowatts of panels, but we found it generated more than we used because we did the things like Glenn was talking about, cutting our electricity consumption, and we got it down to 4 kilowatt hours per day, and the panels generated about 6. Like with water, like we've done a range of stuff with water over time, and I don't want to make this answer too long, but the thing that probably proved more complicated was treating greywater, and we had to have an EPA approved system which the council then had to approve, and we had to send off water quality samples to be lab tested regularly. It worked really well, but because it was a prototype, I eventually burnt a pump out and we couldn't get it fixed. So we've gone back to just diverting greywater to the garden. So it proved to be the most complicated thing. Grid-connected solar has proved to be really good, really low maintenance. Like we probably only cleaned the panels maybe max of 5 times in 24 years. And the original panels lasted, well, the panels are still good, but they're not on the roof anymore, but they lasted 23 years. And we get a modest income, about $1,500 a year back because we're on the high tariffs. So that's the reason we're not disconnected for solar. But also in terms of the living in a community, in practice, our closest neighbours end up with that renewable energy when we're not using it, which is a nice thing if you're living in a neighbourhood, which we usually are. So anyway, that's probably a long enough answer.
And how much does, this for you, for Glenn, how much does an off-grid system actually cost?
It's a bit like how long is a piece of string, but let's talk ballpark figures. If you've got a greenfield site, that means there's no power on the site already. You're probably looking up $30,000-$40,000 to have a system that can generate what a moderate, not a 20 kilowatt hour a day house, maybe a 10 kilowatt hour a day house would consume, and store that energy for at least 3 days of bad weather. That actually is similar to the connection cost if you don't already have power to the site. So what we're seeing now is that standalone systems, as they're called, are actually competing directly with the cost of the grid to be connected. So you can ask yourself, why bother when you're going to start paying bills for the rest of your life when you could spend the same amount of money and have no bills for the rest of your life? Well, until you have to replace your batteries. So yeah, it varies a lot, but it's all about that number. So as Stuart pointed out, 4 kilowatt hours per day, it's a very easy number to get to, and that makes the system so much cheaper.
And is that the grid connection not so much in the suburbs where you're calling up your electricity retailer, or more in rural areas when you need to get lines put to the properties?
Well, they don't actually bring the lines into your property. They'll just drop to the border, to the boundary. So you still have the final run to the house. But yeah, it will be cheaper if there's an existing infrastructure. But in suburbia, basically, unless the house is being knocked down, there will already be electricity supply made available. So it won't be so expensive.
Yeah, thank you. And Rachel, in your research, what was the motivation for a lot of people wanting to have that energy independence?
I'd say it's a combination of economics and ideology, I'd say. For a lot of people, they often start out with, exactly that situation that Glen just discussed, where the cost of electricity from the mains proves to be quite a serious initial investment. And so the alternative is to really start quite small and start off with a couple of panels. And, people often start with a generator or a couple of generators and see how they can live that way. And then as they, get more established, they can start to build what they can afford. And so panels, I think because of that incremental reason, can be more affordable for people to be able to do piece by piece, as opposed to having that entire 30 to 40,000, for example, up front. And then I guess the other side of the coin was exactly, just wanting to be able to show that they could do it themselves and have the opportunity to take some of that power, quote unquote, back, so that they could have a bit more control over the basics of the day-to-day domestic needs and, however you wanted to do your building or house, so that you could then, feel like you're in more control. Often it's about control.
Yeah. Thanks, Rachel. And I think not everyone likes their energy retailers as well. I think that goes into the package as well. We might go to a couple more questions come through. We've got one from Tanya, and I think you've already answered this one, Stuart. Do you still have the original panels, or you replace the whole system?
Look, we ended up having to replace the whole system. The inverter failed, and we spent, because of the history of it, we actually spent $1,000 trying to get it fixed, but we couldn't. And we couldn't match a modern inverter with the old panels. Like Glen would understand this way better than me, but they couldn't do it. I should say we've got a second system. So although the original system was 2 kilowatts, maybe, I can't remember exactly when, 2009 or 10, we put in a 1.5 kilowatt system. And so we've got about 3.5 kilowatts of solar panels. And yeah, but we still have the panels because we've got a bush block, and I'm planning to put some of them down there, and it will actually be off grid.
Thanks. Our next question is from Jessa. What are the benefits of worm farms as opposed to just compost? So maybe one for Stuart and Rachel.
Like we've used worms. Like if you put your compost bin in a shady spot, depending on the type of material you're putting in, if it's mainly food waste, you can actually turn it into a worm farm. If you're trying to do a hot compost, as in where you put in grass clippings or material that will heat up, that's not suitable for worms. But food waste is ideal for worms. And we had a worm farm in a converted 240-litre wheelie bin, and as long as it's in the shade, that's a big enough space. Like the tray type worm farms tend not to be a big enough space once it gets to about 35 degrees. People find the worms die. But if you've got a big enough volume of material for them to hide in and keep cool, they won't do that, yeah. And I guess the benefit is you get liquid out of it, which is a liquid fertiliser, and castings, which is like a concentrated compost, yeah.
And we've got a question for Emma, which is talking a bit more about greywater systems and the regulations. Maybe, Stuart, you just want to talk a little bit more, because I think your original system you had was like a greywater treatment system, which is at the high end of greywater systems rather than simple diversions or filtration systems. Do you want to just talk about the difference maybe between the free and and what you would recommend people to actually do?
Like the first thing is, if you haven't got a use for using that on your garden, there's no point doing Greywater, because the main use for Greywater is to water your garden, and your garden will benefit. Like, you can put it on fruit trees or the not on the edible parts of plants, but it can go on veggies like corn, where the edible parts off the ground, for example. The basic low-cost thing is diverting from the washing machine with a hose, or if you've got access to old plumbing and you can find the outlet pipes, you can get basic diverters that cost $10, $20, and from there you have a hose going to the garden. If you've got gravity on your side, as in downhill. If you haven't got gravity on your side, you can buy a box with a pump in that, when it fills with water, the pump comes on and it will pump the Greywater to the garden. But those diversion options are meant to be temporary. You don't need a permit to do it, as far as I know. You're meant to get a plumber to do any plumbing, but in practice you can do that sort of thing yourself if you're careful. The key things are not to let it run off to your neighbours or to the street, particularly in COVID times where it might contain stuff washed off people, like from the shower. You don't want to endanger either your own household or your neighbours, and you don't want it pooling on the surface, so either birds or dogs or whatever, or children, can touch the Greywater. So you ideally run the hose to a mulched area and have it slightly under the mulch, and you move it as you need to, which might be every couple of days. Back to the treatment system. Treatment systems have to be approved by the state Victorian EPA, and then at the local level, your local government has to approve you putting them at your site. And there are treatment systems that do all household water, including the toilet. But I don't know if there's any currently available in Victoria that only do Greywater and treat it. Like, we had one that was really good, as I said, but it's not on the market anymore, and it made the Greywater clean enough to store indefinitely. And we had bladders installed under the house that we could put the Greywater into, and then we would then use it on the garden and for flushing toilets. And we could have used it for the laundry as well, but we were using rainwater for that. So is that sort of was that enough of the answer, Donna? Yeah.
Yeah, and also with all these comments, and we'll give an email at the end of this session as well, that you can actually email us at council, and we can also follow up on further questions that people might have too.
Sure.
Let's look at a question here, and just talking about from Sam about how the problem with energy efficiency, that there's no big financial driver to do so, and especially with energy connection costs going up. So I think that's actually a question for all three. So I'm not quite sure, Rachel or Glenn, you would like to approach that one about, is there actually a financial benefit with energy efficiency? I know I've got an answer to it, but I thought I'd better go to the panelists as well.
Can I put my 2 cents in? If you're talking about leaving the grid, energy efficiency is such a cost saver. It's insane not to do it. I often quote for off-gridders somewhere between $2,000 and $4,000 a kilowatt hour for a system build. So every kilowatt hour saved is saving you $2,000 to $4,000. So that's why energy efficiency really matters if you're leaving the grid. But on grid, you're right that the efficiency of products are improving, but prices of electricity are going up. Maybe there's a bit of an offset at the moment.
Rachel?
I mean, as we know, the electricity is only going in one direction. So I think the cost saving may not make sense in the initial, if you're talking about replacing appliances or putting in insulation or changing your flooring to something that has more mass. I mean, those things are much more longer term kind of payoffs that, we don't really know what can happen between, in the next 10 or 20 years if it comes to mains electricity, and, if the power keeps going and you're not offsetting it with panels, then, the price might make sense.
Yeah. And Sam, I think Sustainable Victoria did some really good analysis on that payback time as well. So I think it depends actually on what intervention that you're looking at. So especially things around putting like low flow shower heads, and also some of the installation products actually does have a quite quick return on investment. But some of the bigger ticket items such as double glazing, because it is still quite expensive in Australia, has a longer time to actually pay off on that. And it's got a couple more, and then we've got a couple of techie questions here, so I'm looking at you, Glen, through the screen. So what sort of lifetime do you get from microinverters and DC optimizers?
Okay, well, you really should look at the warranty on the product, because that's what it's going to be replaced under. It varies depending on the quality of the product, whether it makes it to the warranty. So I've had microinverters for 5 years on my home. They're still working. DC optimizers actually have an easier job, so they probably last longer. But yeah, I think it really just comes down to the warranty.
And I think Sam's got another follow-up question there about other incentives for batteries, especially if they can be discounted by using virtual power plants.
Okay, I better explain what virtual power plants are. It sounds really virtual. It is. We've got something like 2.5 million homes with rooftop solar in Australia. And a lot of those are starting to add battery storage as well. So that means actually the biggest power generators collectively are the rooftops of your homes in Australia. You know, we've got tens of gigawatts. I think it's about 12 something gigawatts of rooftop solar now. That's, 5 or 6 times bigger than the biggest coal-fired power station. So a virtual power plant is where you aggregate lots of little power plants, i.e. homes like Stuart, and get them to operate in unison to the benefit of the network. Now, that means that if you're providing an extra benefit to the network other than just making electricity, you're making it when they most need it, when the price is high, they can give you a higher return on your electricity. So it's still nascent days for virtual power plants, but almost all the state governments are very excited by this because they can see it solving some of their capacity problems and also the intermittency of generation. So yes, I think virtual power plants will make batteries more affordable, but it's not quite wide enough spread yet.
Oh, thanks, Glen. And go, Rachel.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
I wanted to ask Stuart what he'd observed over his long experience of what he thought had changed in terms of his relationships with the local authorities, whether it be the EPA or council. You mentioned that it was Brunswick Council, now Moreland Council. So do you think that there's been big changes in the time that you've been doing what you're doing?
Yeah, definitely. I think like grid-connected solar was a brand new thing when we did it, and I think Donna or Glen said 2.5 million homes now in Australia, and it's growing rapidly. So it's become an everyday normal thing, and council itself has lots of panels on its own buildings. When we did some of the Greywater stuff early on, it was regarded as illegal almost. But then we went through that massive drought, and people remembered back to earlier droughts and where it had been allowed. And we worked quite closely with the council and EPA Victoria to get a system that was a prototype approved. It was invented by Ismail, who's a biochemist in Melbourne, who does industrial commercial wastewater treatment, but he tried to get a system up to do residential and succeeded in doing it, but commercially it wasn't a business for him to continue. And even rainwater, like when we did that early on, that was ambiguous as to how legal that was, and plumbers in Melbourne didn't know about it. Like they would have where you live at Murramura, Glen, obviously, because you've got rainwater, that's what you live off, and local rural communities obviously have for a century plus. But in Melbourne, plumbers didn't know about it, and the regulators were catching up with how legal it was, and the council itself wouldn't have had specific rules about it yeah, but all that's changed over time. So a lot of it's become really mainstream, I guess, and the plumbers and electricians do know about the sustainable technologies now, which is great.
And Rachel, I had a question for you, something that you raised in your presentation about being flexible and how important that is. Do you want to talk about that a little bit more? Because I think when I've talked to people about their sustainability journey, they're like, oh, I've never done it perfectly. And yeah, it's just like along the way, there's lots of decisions to be made and options. So do you want to talk about that a bit more?
I mean, what Glen and Stuart have spoken to has talked very much about how this kind of journey actually happens in practice. And it does come from having these conversations and learning from other people, and also, you know, being a bit smart about, you know, whether or not your vision or your plan is actually going to be feasible for the amount of time, energy and money that you're willing to put into it. And, you know, a lot of people don't talk about the hidden costs, and that comes to families and relationships. And, you know, a lot of people say if you want to put your family to the test, then you should, you know, build a house together. And so I think it is about being flexible in terms of what you're willing to put up with, to not have a fixed point that you're trying to achieve, that there is no ultimate achievable, sustainable position, but there's only going to be versions of self-sufficiency, and that everyone's trying. And that by doing it, you are contributing positively to things that need to be changed. So it is worth doing without being a martyr to, you know, being off grid because you can prove, you know, your 20 kilowatt system can support you through the apocalypse. You know, is that really the essence of what we're trying to achieve here?
Cool. Thanks, Rachel. So what you've been flexible on, Glen, what would you like to have done differently or along your journey?
I think it all starts with the building itself, the optimizations of where you orientate it, how you glaze it, how the thermal mass you input it into it, the insulation. That's where all the long-term gains are. Everything that comes after that for me. So I've built a few homes, and I think I've got it right this time. So there's a kind of learning process, keeping it simple, but using good materials with, you know, high thermal values. That's been my learning. What would I do differently? Don't underestimate your energy growth. I know I've been talking about energy efficiency, but often, you know, families use more energy. So, you know, planning for a little bit more. It's got easier than it used to be in terms of energy storage. You can actually now get modular batteries, but it used to be you bought it, you used it for 10 years, you replaced it. So, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, and I think it's like there's changing patterns as well in your family. I know Monica Oliphant, who's a real leader in renewable energy in Australia, and she has a graph about the energy use in her house, and she's got the bins of like where it had solar or solar hot water, but she also has indicators when first daughter left home, second daughter left home. So there's always the changing circumstances as well that impact on your energy use. Stuart, what's some of the things that you would like done differently at your place?
Like we never did the big renovation, and it was always, I guess, money that stopped us doing that. But if you live in a house 30 years, maybe that's a regret that we didn't make the house more passive solar and open up the living areas to the backyard, like the indoor-outdoor living, which is what people do with modern homes. So we made the house way more comfortable and enjoyable to be in, but we never did the big renovation. Like we did the retrofit rather than the renovation. So maybe that's a regret. And over time, the debt probably would have been paid off. I don't know, and we would have had a nice house. But the other thing that changed is we now live in a 4-story development zone. So chances are the house would be knocked down as soon as we move anyway. So I don't know. But one of the things that did change, like early on, we were really careful not to use electricity where we didn't need to, and we would use gas as an alternative for heating, for example, or for solar hot water or for cooking. And I know that over the last decade or so, there's been a move to all electric homes, like recognising that gas is a fossil fuel, greenhouse gas. And like, we haven't made that shift to quit gas. Like, we have reverse cycle air conditioning / heating in 4 different spots. So that gets used a lot more than the gas space heater these days. And the solar hot water is boosted with gas, which we can actually turn the booster off for about 10 months of the year. So we can cut down on gas, but we haven't got off grid for gas either. And maybe that's a bit of a regret, but to do it would involve changing our kitchen, which goes back to that first thing I was talking about, which is renovating the house. I don't know. Yeah.
And we're going to have to wrap up soon. I'm just quickly got another question here from Tanya saying, is there any cost analysis available for shading your home using trees in lieu of air conditioning? Tanya, I'm not quite sure there is, but I think it might be good to look up on the Sustainability Victoria website to see if they did actually include external shading in some of that analysis. I'm not quite sure if it has. So I'm not quite sure if any of our panellists might know of any other work.
Yeah,
Glen?
look, it's very significant. I mean, just blocking direct sunlight knocks 10 degrees off your roof straight away, easy. So yes, it does have a big impact.
Yeah.
And
So
like,
we're just about... Sorry, go, Stuart. Yeah.
I was going to say, we planted the ornamental grapevine on the north face and west side of the house, and like, I don't know how much they cost. Like, you're probably talking $20 or something, but it's been there decades and provides a massive amount of shade. And if you're keen, you can make dolmens using the vine leaves.
Sure. So I'm just going to wrap up, ask each of our panelists, like, what's the top thing or the first step that you recommend to someone if they're looking to try and be a bit more water energy independent, or just what's the first step in their sustainability journey? So I might go to you first, Glen.
Sure. Look at what you have already and look at the easy options first. Don't bite the big one straight off. So it might be just water conservation, something simple like that, changing a shower head.
And Stuart?
Yeah, look, I agree. Like, the shower head is an energy thing as well, because it's hot water. So and like in the book I did, there's a simple bucket test. You run water into a bucket for 30 seconds and measure how much is coming out. If it's more than half the bucket, then you need a new shower head. Even if you're renting, it's worth doing yourself, even if the landlord won't pay. But look, beyond that, like, I'd get my energy bills, gas and electricity if you've got both, and look at the megajoules for gas and kilowatt hours for electricity. If you're not buying renewable energy, you'd look at doing that, even if it's not on your house. If you do own the house, like, the cost of these things compared to the cost of a house in Moreland, you're only talking maybe 1% for quite a big solar electricity system, or even 0.5% depending where you live in Moreland, compared to the cost of the house to put in a renewable energy system. Same for solar hot water. And if you want to be keen about water, rainwater tanks are a good option, but Greywater's maybe even cheaper if you do the simple diversions. But you're not talking about a lot of money. If you've got a mortgage, like, mortgage interest rates are only 3% at the moment or thereabouts, you're not talking about if you have to borrow $10,000, $20,000, you're not talking a lot of money in terms of interest. Yeah.
Sure. And Rachel?
Oh, that's such useful information. I'm wondering what I can add to that. I do run sessions and workshops to get people to think about, I guess, what their ideal scenario of self-sufficiency would look like. And I encourage people to do that sort of planning early and to be prepared to change their vision. And so I'm sort of, even though I'm not an architect per se, I enjoy drawing out some of the ideas that I have in a design sense, and also in a like listing sense, to sort of see what's actually important. You know, what if you've got limited cash and limited time and limited options, what are the things you can do with what you have so you don't have to be more in debt? And then also, what kind of communities can you start to look into that could help you to get there? Because, you know, we know that that's the best way to move forward, is not just doing it on your own, but, you know, doing it with other people, even if it's just to sort of have a discussion or, you know, an online group or something that helps you to kind of clarify what it is you want and how you're going to get there.
Right, excellent. Thank you, Rachel. And thank you, Rachel and Stuart and Glen, for presenting and all the awesome information and sharing your stories and journeys with us as well. And this is when I do a bit quick segue for Glen to put the next slide on, talking about what some of the next steps that people could actually do. And just to let you know that there are quite a lot of services for residents that Moreland City Council does provide. So we just launched a couple of new programs, including one for getting solar on your home. So we've actually working with a partner, Solar Savers, to actually make it easier if you are thinking of putting solar on your homes. And as Glen has pointed out, which is a little bit of a no-brainer financially as well. We've also have another project partner helping us make your home more energy efficient. So if it's looking at doing one, they will actually do an energy assessment. It could look at things like doing draft proofing around your home or insulation. So there's also that program as well. And if you've just got some general questions, we also work with the Australian Energy Foundation around our free advice service. So for all these programs, there's actually subsidies available for people who are currently facing financial hardships as well. So for more information, just go to the Moreland Zero Carbon website, which is morelandzerocarbon.org.au, and do energy switch, and you can start seeing some of those services that are actually available. And I'll go to the next slide. Thank you, Glen. And this is just to say, if you want to find out more information and more events that we have coming up, or what local groups are doing in your community, and like Rachel's saying, connecting with other people who you might want to have this discussion with, please go to the morelandzerocarbon.org.au website. We also have an e-newsletter that you can sign up to, and also on Facebook, which we're trying to keep everyone up to date. So that's us wrapping up for now. I'd like to say thank you once again to our three presenters, Rachel, Stuart and Glen. I also like to thank Moreland City Libraries for organising and presenting this event, and particularly to Heidi Babastistos, who is behind the scenes and pulled this all together. So thank you very much, Heidi. It's been fantastic. But more importantly, thank you. Thank you for all your questions and help. And great to see that there's such interest in this topic. And we'll hope that we'll be able to bring some more information and webinars like this into the future as well to help you on your sustainability journeys too. So I hope you enjoyed this lovely balmy evening in Melbourne, and stay safe. Thank you.